Hi guys, hope you're doing well. This video is going to be a prophecy update. We're going to be looking at the fallout from what's going on in Afghanistan and how that is going to prophetically have significant changes geopolitically in the world. And I think they're significant, not minor things. You know, this sometimes we look at these things that are happening. Sometimes we think, you know, oh, whatever. You know, these things always happen. No, I think this is going to be different, and there's a number of reasons why. And hopefully, I can get into this in this video. I will be touching on a couple of verses towards the end here, so bear with me on that. So what do we see with the? So let's jump right into it. I guess would be a good point. So what do we see happening with this debacle that we have going on, and how it this is going to have substantial geopolitical repercussions. Why do I say that? Well, think about it. If as we see America, really the preeminent superpower in the world, that hasn't changed in really, even with this debacle. I mean, they are the preeminent military power in the world. Still economically, they're still an economic superpower in the world. But perceptions mean a lot. And the perceptions are that America has lost its footing or its position as that preeminent power, even though realistically, I mean, they can still project power anywhere in the world, unlike anybody else. They can devastate anything they want to if they really wanted to. If they had the political will to do it, they could do it. I mean, they could send in a force, and within literally days, if not hours, maybe, if a big nation, it would take a little bit longer, but they could realistically go in and completely destroy the infrastructure of a entire country within a very short period of time. No one's had that kind of power in the history of mankind. People forget that. Even Christians, when we're looking at prophetic literature, sometimes you can forget that. America is the only nation really in the history of mankind, other than, we're not talking about nuclear weapons, obviously, that can project that kind of power around the world. Sustained power that it can affect you economically, or it can affect you militarily. It can make changes in your country politically simply by making phone calls and making threats. It's that kind of power, scary power that in the good hands of good people is, it holds, it's kind of like the world's police in a sense. It keeps the animals at bay, as they were, from the free world. Well, America's kind of lost that position or stature as a preeminent power for the free world, the voice for the free world, I should say. They have the power, they have that although it's being squandered, they have that that voice and that platform that they would speak with authority on the part of the free world, that fair play, justice for all, equality for all people, women, men, children. That voice meant something when America talked, and a lot of nations agreed with that and fell in line with that. I mean, you had you look at like Australia, America, or UK, Canada, pretty much most of the major Western countries, Germany, these guys, they pretty much fell in line with that ideology, that ideal of fairness and equality for all, and this kind of stuff. And America had that moral voice, and with this kind of betrayal in such a blatant way, in such a political way, and make no bones about it, this was definitely a political element. I'm not saying that America should stay in wars forever. They should have got out of. They shouldn't have been involved in that situation anyway. In my business, I mean, that's just my personal opinion on it. I mean, there was no reason to send 20 years worth of young men to go in and women to go and die in that situation. It just made a little sense. But be that as may, that's the choice that politically they made, and the American people continue to tolerate it, instead of holding their leaders accountable. But when you think about it, it's like so many people, so many nations joined in on that foray into insanity, which is, we're going to go into this third world country that has no ideal of the freedom and democracy and the things that we're talking about, equality and this kind of stuff, and we're going to try to superimpose that upon these people, and we're going to do it, thousands of miles, tens of thousands of miles away from our nations, that we're going to sustain for years. I mean, it's a recipe for, ultimately, you're going to have a pullout. At some point in time, you're going to say that the cost is too great to bear, and it's going to be a burden too hard to sustain, and it drains your resources, your people, your military, your everything. On what was the purpose other than, well, we're going to keep it from becoming a platform for terrorists? Well, okay, what did you accomplish? It's going to be, they're already saying after 2, 3, 4 days of it falling, it's a platform for terrorists. So what did 20 years of fighting, what was the purpose of that then? What was the purpose of sending young men and women off to die if within 4 days you've given them a platform for terrorism again? It made absolutely no sense to anybody who's got any common sense. And okay, well, how about platforms elsewhere? I mean, there's other nations out there. How about Pakistan, which has shown itself to be in many ways a platform for terrorism, attacks on India and other places? How about, you go down the list, Yemen and oh my goodness, Sudan and other places. I mean, you look around the world, there's plenty of places. You can go to every one of them, invade all of them too. It just made absolutely no sense to do that, right? Well, anybody can look at that and go, yeah. Well, so it should tell us, from this, from a Christian point of view, the fallout of this is that America is perceived as weakening and distrustful. It's so much so that you even have, elements where China has come out recently and said, hey, friends of America need to rethink their associations, their friendships, their loyalties. That's what China's already playing at and already saying, and many are saying right now that it's only a matter of time before, China invades Taiwan. Would America even do anything? And if you're Taiwan, you have to be thinking, right now, you have to be thinking, can we even trust America to come to our aid, or England or anybody else? Because England obviously wouldn't be able to sustain operations for years against a, powerful Chinese military right across the strait there, right across over the Taiwan Strait. I mean, if you're Taiwan, you have to seriously be thinking right now that you're on your own. That America's might give you political coverage, they might give you lip service, but they're not somebody who's going to militarily be pulling up the coming to your aid. They're not a cavalry that you can trust is going to come over the hill to save you, from the bad elements that have surrounded you. That's where you're at if you got to be thinking if you're Taiwan. How about if you're Ukraine? If you're Ukraine, you have to be thinking that right now, do you trust America to come to your aid against an aggressive Russia? I mean, you have to be thinking probably not. How about NATO? NATO in general, because they get a big black eye right now in this whole Afghanistan fiasco. Also, that Biden could say, and it was all politically driven in my opinion, so that Biden and his administration could say, hey, on the anniversary of 9/11, 20-year anniversary of 9/11 coming up, we have all the troops out of, we've ended this, 20-year war that America was involved in, it was going to be this big thing. It was all about optics. It was all about political ease. That's all it was. It was basically to them, even though innocent people were going to die because of the disastrous way in which they done it, they really didn't care. And if you watch the interview where Biden's in it, he really just, with Stephanopoulos, he just seemed to say, yeah, we took that into account, and we really didn't care. It was basically like, well, yeah, little girls are going to be taken off and, sold off to men and, sold as sex slaves, and little boys too. And, people that worked with this are going to be beheaded and killed, hung, whatever, tortured. That we took that into account. We figured, it was better for us to have this anniversary for us because it was going to work out politically for us. I mean, that's basically how cold-hearted the guy that's elected into the president's office is. Do you honestly think anybody around the world missed that? If I didn't miss it, and most people that watched it didn't miss it, which I'm sure they didn't, I'm sure other people around the world, leaders, are, basically got that same cold shiver down the back of their spine that the person in office absolutely has no feeling whatsoever, no real, no matter how they tried to play him out, it was like this, gentle old soul that cared about, the people of the world in America. What you saw was a guy who's, callous, cold, who only cares about himself, his family, and his political posturing or position, and absolutely cares nothing about anyone else in this world, even people, little children who are going to be tortured and killed or sold off as sex slaves. He basically said that on interview with Stephanopoulos. That's what he said. The world's heard it, and it should resonate, and it is resonating around the world. I'm sure of it, in all the capitals of the world. And that's the fallout. The fallout is that what you end up with is, you're gonna see greater resentment towards America, less people depending on America or trusting America, I should say. And you're going to see alliances now have to be formed where people have to rethink those alliances where they trust America. What if you're Poland right now? You got to be thinking, wow, are we even going to be able to trust America? You're going to have to draw closer to Europe and hopefully those allies, because you can't really even believe that NATO is going to come to your aid. You can't believe that America is going to come across here and help you. I mean, that's how you have to be thinking. Yeah, you want America's, money and weaponry and things like that, and you'll probably still involve yourself and give lip service to training and all the things that you would come along with NATO. But you have to be thinking in the back of your mind, we really can't depend on them to come to our aid. And I think that what they're going to probably want to do is saying, we need to form alliances right here among like-minded Eastern European bloc nations that are part of Europe, part of NATO, to be like a subset of NATO, like Romania, Ukraine, Poland, so forth. Those Slavic nations. We have to come together to protect ourselves against an aggressive Russia. That's what I think is going to come out of this. And the same thing for Western nations. You have to be thinking the same thing. If you're I do think you're going to see the traditional allies. Like, personally, I think America's going to be part of that beast empire, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But again, the fallout of this is that if you're in another nation right now, you have to be thinking, what in the world? You have to start rethinking your alliances. And let's say you're Australia or New Zealand, right there in the back doorstep of China. I mean, that's a real threat that you have to seriously think about. And that's where I think, some form of a new, alliance, new power is now starting to come into focus, where they're going to have to say, hey, we need to have a new union. And they would seriously be thinking about joining that union in a sense. And that's what I was talking about, where you could see the UK, you could see Australia, Canada, and America ultimately joining into some kind of new union that ultimately wants to become that beast empire. The 7-nation empire, as it were, made up of 10 leaders, and 3 of them get overthrown, and then there's ultimately 7, and then they give those 10 give their power and influence to the Antichrist, who comes on the scene and basically deposes 3 of them. Who, whatever these regional governors or whatever they are, most likely, of the 7-nation confederation that's going to rise up at the last hour. And it only reigns for 1 hour, as we know in Revelation chapter 17, which we went over previously. But this time we're going to actually touch base in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, but time allowing. But my point is that when you look at this, what do we see happening in this fallout is that, number one, China's going to become more aggressive. China's going to see itself as, in a prime opportunity now to challenge America for sway and influence in nations that it didn't have sway and influence. And it's going to aggressively pursue more market share around the world, and where it can influence them with its ideology of communism. That's going to be on the upswing, not the downswing. That's very dangerous for the world. especially for the West and the free world. And what's America going to say? Oh, don't do that. Oh, that's not fair. That's not fair to play. When you've abandoned the people and just ran out on them, and the people that signed on with you to help you, and you basically showed the world that you really just don't even care, and you're just playing lip service, they're not going to believe you. You've lost any credibility. And then it comes down to Russia, another aggressive nation, that aggressor nation that can be seen in that way. And that could be where they, in essence, as we see, I think it paves the way for the Gog-Magog alliance to form and become, it sees its opportunity. It sees it dangling out there, a chance to acquire wealth, money, gasoline, oil, all those things that are in the Mediterranean that they want. And I think they've got a Mediterranean port now, Syria. Now all you need to do is acquire that oil. Since the oil up there over the Euphrates River is out of bounds because America's got its troops stationed there, how about the oil and wealth that Israel has, in abundance right there, and it's right there in the Mediterranean, that Turkey was eyeballing. Well, you can see where Russia and Putin could certainly be in league with Turkey and Iran on acquiring and get a percentage of that, just like they're getting a percentage out of Libya, and they have one that they thought coming out of Syria, and since that's been taken away, they could say, hey, it's fair game on this now. And you can see where now that taking that spoil that it's talked about in the Gog-Magog war starts to become more reality. And America, what are they going to do? I mean, they've shown that they have no steadfastness for their allies. And so you have to look at Israel now, and you say Israel is going to be deeply isolated. Israel right now must be feeling extremely isolated. And they have to be saying, we can't trust America. we can't trust them to actually be, our ally in a serious situation. They may supply us with weaponry, but are they going to come to our aid or defense? This is what you have to be thinking, and in Israel's part, they have to be thinking that they're extremely isolated right now, which is exactly what we'd expect to see if you're looking at Isaiah chapter 17 and the destruction of Damascus, or where Israel feels threatened and has to act against Iran, who they feel is building nuclear weapons, or they have to attack Damascus in some dramatic fashion, or something dramatic happens there, and those nations uses some event, be it a red flag event or not, or a real thing, and Damascus is destroyed. They could use that as a reason to invade Israel, so that they could go and take the spoil. The Hegelian dialectic thing could happen. You could see something like that happening. You could see where they would say, hey, just like the burning of the Reichstag in a sense. You could see where they would say, hey, you could see some world event, a destruction of Damascus occurring, and blaming it on Israel when in fact they didn't do it at all, maybe. And that would be the reason to go in and take away the power nuclear weapons of Israel. You could see something like that happening, which would lead to the Gog-Magog war. But I see Israel becoming extremely isolated right now, and you see Russia and China being the antagonist nations that looking for those new markets, new opportunities, becoming the more aggressive nation to get those markets. And that becomes, so from this fallout, I see a much more dangerous world. Not because, Afghanistan was so important as a geopolitical or, geographic area of the world, as it were. I mean, it's when you start looking at it, it's like, well, really, it's really not that important. But when you start looking at it in the sense of the greater geopolitical fallout of it, now the fact that America and NATO and its allies, primarily England and others to a degree, basically abandoned the people that supported them and just said, sayonara, then yeah, it makes people at that point, it changes the whole landscape geopolitically, as far as allies and everything else. So what we expect to see, I think, a more aggressive and challenging China. I think you see the same for Russia as it strengthens its allies with Turkey, alliance with Turkey and Iran, who then I think will lead to this Gog-Magog war. And as we are looking for these things politically, are we looking for these things prophetically to happen? The landscape is being laid for this to happen, and as America was pulling out of the Middle East anyway, it's a perfect recipe for that event to occur. A lot of Christians have been looking at this for years and how it would play out, but now, I mean, we can really realistically see a scenario like that being played out, and it's realistic. It's not unrealistic. Lastly, like I said, we see the isolation more politically of Israel, even though at the same time you have this peace accord happening, the Abraham Accords happening behind the scenes. Interesting with the people involved in that as well. We should definitely keep an eye on that. So you have a peace agreement happening, as the Bible talked about and prophesied. At the same time, you see a waning ideal of the old America into this new transforming, morphing America that I think will combine with other nations, 7 nations, I think, at the end of the day, that will coalesce together and become this final beast empire, in my opinion, on this, in my interpretation of this. I could be wrong, so I hold these things kind of loosely, but that's how I see it. And this final beast empire will come on the scene very rapidly, very quickly, because of world events that are taking place around the world. And it could be the Gog-Magog war facilitates this, quick rush into having a vacuum that has to be filled, and that's where you see this beast empire come on the scene. Remember, they're only going to reign for 1 hour, and the Antichrist was going to be given total power for only 3.5 years. So you're talking about a very short period of time, but a lot of destruction that will happen in that short period of time. Obviously, I believe in pre-tribulation rapture, so some of these events I think we will see as a church, and other events we won't. But it is something that we need to keep our eye on, because as Christ told us to be alert, and to be aware, to be looking, He gives us all those warnings. And as Christians, we need to do that. It's a commandment. It's not a suggestion, but it's a commandment for us to be looking and ready. That means we need to be able, and the fact that we can see that all around the world at this time is pretty prophetic in and of itself. And we would never be able to see it any other time in history, but now that we have worldwide communication instantaneously, we all can keep an eye on it and watch it and be ready, just as He commanded. And this is back in 200-300 years ago, even 100 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do that. We would be sitting there going, we'd have no idea what's going on around the world until weeks or months after it's even happened, if ever. So the fact that we can see it is very prophetic in and of itself, very fulfilling. So anyway, we're going to jump into a couple of verses here real quick and give you an idea of why I believe the beast empire is America and its some remaining allies are going to revamp itself, remorph itself into a new union, which we know as the beast empire. So anyway, we're just going to look at it real quick. Obviously, I won't read Revelation chapter 17. I've read that before. If you get a chance, please do so. Revelation 17, roughly around verse 12, is what I would be talking about. But we're going to jump into Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to just look at, won't read it all because obviously it's a little bit too much to read, but we're just going to read a little bit here of chapter 7, and then we're going to jump over to chapter 8. I'm going to start at verse 24. And it says, "As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will rise, and another will rise after them, and he will be different from the previous one, and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints and the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations to times in the law, and will be given into his hand a time and times and half a time, or 3.5 years." So we know that there's 7 years altogether allocated for this final end time period of time. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. We see this picked up on Daniel will be in Daniel 11, Revelation 11, Revelation 13, so forth, where it kind of talks about this stuff and alludes to this. Again, Revelation 17 specifically talks again about this time period in which this final beast empire is going to come into power, the 10 horns, 7 heads, so forth. It kind of talks about that as well, which is directly referenced what we just read, which tells you that it's one and the same. This final beast empire and this king, which is what this individual is that's talking about here, says, when it's talking about these 10 that will rise up, these 10 kings, and it says that one will rise up after him, and he will be different than the rest. I take this as being the Antichrist, the one who's going to be making these alterations in times, and that's going to happen in the final 3.5 or last 7 years, potentially in the last 3.5 years when he takes full power. We'll pick up again as he's the little horn and so forth, spoken of in Daniel chapter 7, or Daniel chapter 8. Apologize, I'm trying to get all this in. But we're going to go ahead and just pick up in verse 23, and then we'll read it all the way through until we get to like verse 25. So it won't be that much, but we'll go ahead and look at it real quick. And it just says, and again, it's talking about this latter period of time when you have this individual and the power that he's going to have, which is directly correlates with Revelation chapter 13, this Antichrist figure, the power that he has, the influence he's going to have. And I think he's nearly on the scene. I think he's coming very soon, which means his kingdom is going to come on the scene, which is why we see the waning of America's influence and its position around the world. I think it's very prophetic, and that's why I wanted to do this video. It's something we should be looking for. It says, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will be, not by his own power, because he's empowered by Satan. Satan is the one who's given his power. Revelation 13 confirms this. 13:2, actually. When he goes on, it says, he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. Again, 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 through 10, we see the same thing being talked about, which again confirms the fact that this is the Antichrist. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. Revelation 13:7 talks about the destruction of the saints and overcoming the saints. We're talking about the tribulation saints, which I think truly is picked up on in Revelation chapter 7, verses 14 and on, and explained as the tribulation saints. And also in Revelation chapter 20, basically 1 through basically 4, where it kind of talks about the tribulation saints as being the one in the first resurrection. Again, specifically identifying a certain group that are just picked up in the tribulation period itself, and that's why we call them the tribulation saints. It goes on, it says in verse 25 of Daniel 8, it says, and through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed in his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart. Again, perfectly falling in line with what we see in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, where he magnifies himself as being God and goes into the rebuilt temple and declares himself to be God. Basically magnifying himself above everything, all gods and everything else. Exactly what we expect to see. And Daniel is talking of this, and we get greater clarity in 2 Thessalonians. We also see this in Revelation chapter 13, basically verses 3 through 10. Basically the same thing. And he says, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. And he will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken. Revelation 19:19, it's perfectly identified it. He'll be broken without human agency. Exactly what we see in Revelation 19:19, when Jesus returns with his army and his angels and his people, and he basically the Antichrist and the false prophet are taken alive and thrown into the lake of fire. It says basically their end of their reign isn't because of any human agency, it's because of Jesus himself, and his kingdom has come, and he puts an end to their reign instantaneously. And at that point, he sets up his kingdom here on earth for the millennial reign, or the Sabbath day of rest, and the basically elevation of Israel at that point to become that preeminent nation during this millennial reign. That will be something that we all pray for when we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about his kingdom coming. We're actually praying for these events to take place, if you know it or not. You're praying for the end of Satan's reign on this world. We're praying for all these events, the tribulation period, the judgment of the people. And even in Revelation, it tells us to celebrate that event, because it's a time in which God will judge and test the people of this world. And it is a time of testing, as he talks about in Revelation chapter 3. So anyway, lots of things happening. I think prophetically, amazing things are going to happen very quickly. And just like he says, when it comes, it's going to come like a flood. And it is coming like a flood. It's coming very quickly. Things are happening very rapidly. And if you can't see that, boy, I'd say get in the Word. I mean, it's just exciting times as a Christian to be alive and see these events. It's happening very fast. And we're seeing this just avalanche of prophetic things happening that never were like that before and are now. So get excited, and remember, Jesus is coming back for us. He promised that he would keep us from the time of testing, not through it, but from it. So that means I believe we have the great promise of going to be with the Lord and spend our eternity with him. And just like he promised in Luke chapter 17, I won't have time to read it, but basically he talks about just as the times of Noah and just as the times of Lot, they went into the ark. They were taken out of Sodom before that destruction period came. I think he's alluding to the pre-tribulation rapture of all those who trust and believe in him. And then comes the time of testing upon the world, the 7 years of tribulation. I think that's a God confirming, a Christ confirming reality of the pre-tribulation rapture. And I think it's near, very near. And we need to be praying for all the people. Pray for those in Afghanistan. Pray for the saints around the world, that they're ready, they're equipped, they're prepared, and they're out faithfully sharing the gospel with the lost. God bless you. Keep looking up. Exciting times to be alive. We'll see you.